California in the 1970s was a place of contradictions, a golden coast glimmering with prosperity, sunshine, and suburban dreams, shadowed by an undertow of paranoia. In the quiet neighborhoods of Sacramento, something sinister had begun. Women were being assaulted in their own homes, often with their husbands or boyfriends present, forced to witness the unthinkable. Powerless to intervene, the attacker struck with chilling precision, slipping into homes undetected, his face masked, his movements methodical. He was dubbed the East Area Rapist by police, a name that quickly morphed into shorthand for terror. He didn't just break in, he stalked, often days in advance, learning routines, studying the layout, even placing items around the house to gauge the occupants' habits. When he struck, he tied up his victims, placing dishes on the backs of the male partners and threatening to kill them if he heard a sound. Then he'd disappear into the night, leaving behind broken lives and unanswered questions. The scale of his crimes escalated. Authorities initially believed they were dealing with a cunning and calculated sexual predator. But as time went on, the situation darkened. The attacker's patterns evolved. He began to taunt victims and law enforcement with cruel phone calls. He demonstrated familiarity with police procedure and forensic protocols. He often left no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no hair, nothing traceable. Fear spread like wildfire through the suburbs. Hardware stores ran out of locks, guns were flying off shelves, and community meetings were packed with terrified residents desperate for safety. But the nightmare didn't end in Sacramento. It migrated south. The attacks took on a darker, deadlier tone. Now, the victims weren't surviving. Couples were being found murdered in their homes or nearby, brutally bludgeoned or shot. Law enforcement gave the killer a new name, the original Night Stalker. Though the patterns were strikingly similar, authorities didn't initially connect the two waves of crimes. There were no clear fingerprints, no viable witnesses, only fear and shattered communities. It would take years before analysts and dedicated detectives began to see the connections. By the early 1980s, Southern California had become a breeding ground of terror. People were locking their doors, buying dogs, and installing floodlights. Newspapers ran stories of butchered families, and whispers of a single, calculating man behind it all began to circulate. But he never stayed in one place for long, and he always seemed a step ahead of the police. Without any physical trace left behind, there was no path forward, only a mounting collection of bodies. A haunting pattern of control, fear, and violence. In 2001, a pivotal breakthrough confirmed what a few had already suspected. DNA evidence proved that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same man. He had evolved from a rapist to a murderer and evaded capture for decades. But even with this knowledge, the identity of the killer remained elusive. Every door knocked, every cold lead revisited, every victim's account poured over again and again. It all led to dead ends. He remained a phantom, a figure that haunted multiple counties in California. Over time, the killer seemed to vanish. The crimes stopped, but the scars remained. Survivors and victims' families waited, some patiently, others in agony for justice. Law enforcement kept boxes of evidence, decades old, slowly growing colder as leads dried up. But there was one element that would never go away: DNA. It was a silent witness, preserved for a future when science might catch up to evil. In quiet evidence lockers, swabs and slides waited for technology to evolve. And somewhere, the killer walked free. The Golden State Killer, as he would eventually be known, eluded capture for more than 40 years. But his crimes left a lasting mark on the soul of California. Communities forever altered, a legacy of fear, and a promise from investigators that one day the mask would be lifted. The question that lingered for decades, who was the man behind the mask, remained unanswered. But the truth was drawing closer than anyone could have imagined. In 2018, after more than 4 decades of speculation, horror, and heartbreak, investigators finally pulled back the veil on one of America's most prolific and elusive serial offenders. The break came not through an eyewitness or a confession, but through a technology still in its infancy: genetic genealogy. The method relied on uploading crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, where it could be matched with distant relatives The breakthrough technique had already solved cold cases, but applying it to the Golden State Killer case was unprecedented in scope. Working in secrecy, a small team of investigators began piecing together a family tree, slowly narrowing their focus from thousands of potential suspects to one man, Joseph James Dungello, a former police officer with a history of burglaries and violent tendencies. Dungello had lived a quiet life in Citrus Heights, not far from where many of the attacks had taken place. He had married, raised children, and maintained the appearance of a law-abiding citizen. But behind the facade lay a legacy of terror. On April 24, 2018, authorities moved in. Dungello, then 72 years old, was arrested outside his home. Inside, detectives found items that eerily matched the killer's known behavior: weapons, keepsakes, and evidence of surveillance on neighbors. As the news broke, survivors and victims' families, many of whom had waited most of their lives for justice, gathered around televisions and phones in stunned silence. The monster had a face, and it was one no one had suspected. In court, Dungello appeared frail and subdued, a ghost of the man who had once instilled such fear. He was charged with 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping, but those charges barely scratched the surface of the pain he inflicted. To avoid the death penalty, he pled guilty to all counts and admitted to dozens more crimes beyond the statute of limitations. His sentencing in 2020 was not just a legal procedure, it was a reckoning. Victims stood before him and told their stories. They spoke of trauma, of lost loved ones, of nights spent looking over their shoulders. They spoke for those who could not speak for themselves, and they did so with strength. Dungello sat motionless, offering little reaction, but the weight of his crimes echoed in every corner of the courtroom. The capture of the Golden State Killer marked a watershed moment in criminal justice. It demonstrated the power of persistence, of evolving technology, and of never giving up. Law enforcement agencies across the country began revisiting their cold cases. Now armed with a new tool, genetic genealogy became a standard bearer of hope for families still waiting, for communities still hurting. But the resolution also carried a heavy emotional cost. For decades, people had lived in fear. Some had been wrongfully suspected. Others had lost faith that justice would ever come. The unmasking of Joseph Dungello brought closure, but it also reopened wounds. It reminded the world of what had been lost and what it had taken to reach the truth today. The legacy of the Golden State Killer endures not just in headlines, but in a transformed justice system and a collective vow that no matter how long it takes, the shadows can be pierced, monsters can be found, and the truth, once buried, can rise. Wichita, Kansas, in the mid-1970s, was a seemingly idyllic American town, a place where neighbors waved. Children played freely in cul-de-sacs, and doors were often left unlocked. But underneath this quiet Midwestern veneer, a storm was brewing. A darkness born not in alleyways or abandoned warehouses, but in the heart of suburbia. The first signs of terror emerged on January 15, 1974, when the Otero family was found murdered in their modest home. The parents, Joseph and Julie, and two of their young children, Josephine and Joseph Jr., were discovered bound, strangled, and left in a grotesque tableau that chilled even seasoned investigators. The city reeled. Police were baffled. There was no sign of forced entry, and while some of the crimes seemed almost staged, nothing appeared to have been stolen. The brutality was deliberate, methodical. This wasn't a crime of passion or a burglary gone wrong. It was a message, but no one yet knew from whom. For several years, Wichita lived under a veil of anxiety. Then, in 1977, more horror. Shirley Vian, a mother of three, was killed in her home under disturbingly similar circumstances. Just months later, Nancy Fox would suffer the same fate. Each time, the killer seemed to grow bolder, more theatrical. Then came the letters he wrote to local news stations and police, taunting them. In one, he coined the moniker that would come to define his legacy: BTK, bind, torture, kill, a name that mirrored the twisted rituals he imposed on his victims. The letters revealed a killer obsessed with control, both physical and psychological. He craved recognition, demanded attention, and painted himself as a figure beyond the reach of ordinary justice. He referenced other notorious killers like Jack the Ripper and the Son of Sam, placing himself within their grotesque pantheon. The media, unwillingly, became part of his game. His words would arrive typed or handwritten, filled with typos, coded language, and chilling detail only the killer could know. Despite a full-scale manhunt, the BTK killer remained a phantom. Investigators pored over thousands of leads, conducted hundreds of interviews, and kept his profile active. The FBI profilers built psychological composites: a white male, likely in his 30s or 40s, intelligent, organized, and likely married with a family. He would appear perfectly normal to outsiders: a neighbor, a co-worker, perhaps even someone sitting in church pews on Sunday. As years passed, BTK's presence faded from the headlines, but not from memory. In the 1980s, his silence gave way to speculation. Had he moved, died, or simply gone dormant, satisfied with the terror he had sown? For over a decade, Wichita lived in uneasy peace, always wondering if he would strike again. Then, in 1991, BTK's last known murder occurred. Dolores Davis. She was killed in her home, bound and strangled like the others. But even as the city reeled once more, the killer disappeared again. By the late 1990s, BTK had become more legend than reality, a cautionary tale whispered at night, an unsolved shadow in police files. The trail had gone cold, but the case never truly closed. Detectives maintained a hidden task force. They clung to every piece of evidence: ligatures, fibers, witness accounts, crime scene photos, and most notably, the killer's own words. His letters had become invaluable windows into his disturbed psyche, and yet also a source of endless frustration, promising answers, but always just out of reach. Then, in 2004, on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, BTK reemerged. A letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle, including crime scene photographs and details that only the killer could know. Wichita plunged back into fear. New letters followed, each one more confident, more arrogant. He left packages in parks and at libraries, often including dolls bound in the same way as his victims. He wanted to be noticed again. He needed it. The monster wasn't finished. For 30 years, the man who called himself BTK remained hidden, in plain sight. His twisted desire for control and notoriety had driven a string of brutal murders, crimes that had stumped law enforcement and tormented a community. But when he resurfaced in 2004, seeking renewed attention, his compulsion to be known would become his greatest mistake. As new letters began arriving at local media outlets and police stations, Wichita's cold case unit sprang back into high gear. BTK's correspondence was laced with cryptic codes, crime scene details, and warped self-portrayals. Yet this time, the digital age was no longer in its infancy. Investigators began to notice something: BTK's arrogance. He wanted to talk, to tell his story, to control the narrative once again. He believed himself untouchable, but the digital breadcrumbs he left behind would become the key to his unraveling. In one of his letters, BTK asked police whether they could trace a floppy disk. They responded publicly in the newspaper, telling him no, they couldn't. It was a trap, and he fell for it. In early 2005, he sent a disk to a local news station. Forensics quickly identified metadata on the file that led to a deleted Microsoft Word document. Embedded within it was the name of the last person to edit the file, Dennis. The document had been created at Christ Lutheran Church. A quick web search turned up Dennis Rader, president of the church council. It was a stunning moment. Could the sadistic serial killer really be a local church leader, a code compliance officer for Park City, and a family man? It seemed almost impossible. Rader was married, had 2 children, and was known for his active role in the community. But surveillance soon confirmed what investigators feared. They had their man. To be absolutely certain, detectives needed DNA. They obtained a warrant to test a pap smear sample from Rader's daughter, taken during a past medical procedure. The result, a familial match to the crime scene DNA. BTK had been found. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested. The man who had eluded authorities for decades didn't resist. When interrogated, he spoke coldly, almost clinically, about his crimes. He detailed each murder as if recounting a routine chore. There was no remorse, only control. He relished the title BTK, calling his actions projects and referring to his victims with dehumanizing detachment. To him, the killings were calculated performances scripted and rehearsed long before he ever entered his victims' homes. The community was shaken. This wasn't a monster lurking in the shadows. It was the man next door. His co-workers, his congregation, even his own family were stunned. No one had suspected that Dennis Rader, the polite city employee and community volunteer, had lived a double life. He had compartmentalized his existence to a terrifying degree: father and killer, husband and predator. At trial, Rader pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. He gave a chillingly detailed account of each one, recounting how he stalked his victims, how he planned the bindings, the torture, the killing. His own words stunned the courtroom. The composure with which he recounted atrocities confirmed the extent of his psychopathy. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, ensuring he would die behind bars. The capture of BTK was more than a police victory, it was a psychological revelation. It challenged long-held beliefs about what evil looks like. Dennis Rader didn't fit the stereotypical image of a killer. He wasn't a loner or a drifter. He was a father, a husband, a community leader. Yet beneath that facade lay one of the most twisted minds in American criminal history. The case also became a landmark in criminal profiling and forensic advancement. It demonstrated the necessity of adapting investigative methods to evolving technologies. Metadata, genetic genealogy, and behavioral analysis all played crucial roles in the final chapters of the BTK investigation. Law enforcement agencies across the country took note. But for the families of the victims, the pain didn't end with Rader's arrest. The horror they had lived with for decades was now given a face, a voice. And that voice, chilling and remorseless, haunted them anew. Still, many expressed relief. Justice had finally come. The man who had held an entire city hostage with fear was finally unmasked and caged. Today, Dennis Rader remains in solitary confinement. He spends 23 hours a day in a small cell. The name BTK, once synonymous with terror, is now a reminder of what can happen when justice is patient, vigilant, and unyielding. Los Angeles in the 1980s was a city of sunlight and shadows, a place where celebrity glamour lived uneasily beside crack epidemics and spiraling crime rates. Amidst this contrast, in South Central, a silent predator stalked the streets. Women, mostly black, often sex workers or struggling with addiction, began disappearing or were found murdered. Their bodies discarded in alleys, dumpsters, and overgrown lots. Many were found partially clothed or naked, shot at close range. The killings were brutal, the pattern disturbingly consistent. By 1985, there was enough of a trend for LAPD detectives to recognize something dark was at work. A task force was quietly formed, linking the crimes through ballistic evidence and similar victim profiles. Still, the investigation was kept low-key, the media mostly unaware. Some believed the muted attention was racially motivated. The victims were marginalized, their disappearances met with little outcry. Within the community, fear took hold. Women began walking in groups, watching each other's backs, and whispering warnings about a killer on the loose. But then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the murders stopped. For over a decade, silence. The killer seemed to vanish, leaving behind a string of unsolved murders and grieving families. Many of the cases went cold, boxed up in evidence rooms and pushed aside by new crimes. Then in 2002, after years of stillness, the nightmare returned. A woman, unconscious but alive, was discovered after having been raped, shot, and left for dead. She survived and her story bore eerie resemblance to those past cases. Ballistics confirmed it. The grim sleeper, as he would come to be called by the media, had awoken. The police now faced a terrifying realization. This wasn't a forgotten killer resurfacing. This was someone who had been living quietly in their midst, potentially for decades. The LAPD officially reopened the case, forming a new task force. Flyers with sketches and victim profiles reemerged, and officers canvassed neighborhoods for new leads. Still, despite the renewed effort, progress was slow. The killer left behind very little forensic evidence. His victims, often living transient lives, made it difficult to construct exact timelines. Leads fizzled out. Journalists began asking questions. How had this case slipped into the background? Why had so little been done during the initial wave of murders? Community activists voiced their anger. The title Grim Sleeper emerged from the chilling possibility that the killer had taken a 14-year hiatus, but that came under scrutiny. What if he had never stopped, just changed his methods or his targets? DNA technology was improving, but it was still years away from the breakthroughs that would ultimately change the game. Detectives pored over files, comparing case notes and photographs, trying to find connections. The more they dug, the more they realized how many potential victims had been overlooked. Women, forgotten by society, were now part of an expanding list. And still, the killer walked free. He was a ghost, with a pattern striking vulnerable women, dumping them in familiar alleys, then disappearing into the same neighborhoods. He seemed to know the terrain intimately, navigating the decaying infrastructure of South Los Angeles with eerie confidence. Whoever he was, he had eluded police for nearly 25 years. The clock was ticking, but the full picture, the identity, the motive, the monstrous routine remained hidden in the shadows. The case of the Grim Sleeper might have continued to haunt Los Angeles for decades, if not for a groundbreaking shift in forensic science. In 2010, cold case detectives decided to take a bold step using a then-novel technique known as familial DNA searching. It wasn't the killer's DNA they were seeking directly, but a close relative's. From earlier investigations, police had preserved DNA samples left at several of the crime scenes. The DNA profile was consistent, indicating the same man had murdered at least 10 women. When they ran this profile through a newly available database of convicted felons, it didn't match anyone directly, but something close appeared, a partial match that pointed toward a man named Christopher Franklin. Christopher had recently been arrested on an unrelated weapons charge, but the partial DNA match indicated he wasn't the killer. Someone closely related to him likely was. Investigators turned their attention to his father, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., a retired sanitation worker and former mechanic for the LAPD. He lived in the same neighborhood where many of the murders had occurred. To avoid tipping off their suspect, police initiated a covert operation. They followed Lonnie to a pizza joint and retrieved a half-eaten slice from his discarded plate. Lab analysis confirmed the DNA matched the profile of the Grim Sleeper. After more than 2 decades of hunting a ghost, they had a name. On July 7, 2010, officers arrested Lonnie Franklin Jr. at his South Los Angeles home. Inside, they uncovered a trove of chilling evidence. Hidden behind walls and in storage were hundreds of photographs of women, many unconscious or appearing lifeless. Some were confirmed victims, others were never identified. Among the most disturbing discoveries were trophies, personal items taken from victims, consistent with behavior attributed to serial killers. During questioning, Franklin was largely uncooperative. He offered no confession and expressed little emotion, but the evidence was overwhelming. In addition to the photos and DNA, ballistic tests linked Franklin's gun to several murders. His house, his habits, and his past employment all pointed to a predator who had exploited his proximity to vulnerable women, many of whom were sex workers or battling addiction. In 2016, Franklin was tried and convicted of 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The trial was lengthy and emotional, with survivors and family members delivering heart-wrenching testimonies. The prosecution painted a picture of a remorseless killer who hunted in silence, hiding in plain sight. Franklin was sentenced to death, but in March 2020, before the sentence could be carried out, he was found unresponsive in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. He was pronounced dead at age 67. The cause of death was never officially released, but foul play was not suspected. The impact of his crimes, however, did not die with him. The case left scars across south-central Los Angeles, particularly in Black communities, that felt the city had failed them. Many residents believed the murders were not taken seriously enough. For too long, in part because of the victims' backgrounds, critics argued that if the victims had come from wealthier or whiter neighborhoods, the investigation might have moved faster. In the aftermath of Franklin's arrest, law enforcement agencies began to reassess how they prioritize missing persons and homicide cases involving marginalized victims. Community advocates pushed for more inclusive policies, demanding attention and justice for all victims, regardless of their social status. The case became a symbol of both technological progress and social failure, a stark reminder of who is seen and who is ignored. The grim sleeper had remained hidden in plain sight, his crimes overlooked for too long, but his legacy of loss, outrage, and long-delayed justice continues to echo in the city he terrorized. While the trial may be over and the man dead, the questions he raised about law enforcement, society, and the value of human life remain chillingly unresolved. It began in May of 1985 in Lexington County, South Carolina, a tranquil stretch of suburbia where neighborhoods felt safe and doors were still left unlocked. 17-year-old Shari Smith was finishing her senior year of high school, full of life and looking forward to her graduation ceremony just days away. She left her home one afternoon to run a simple errand, dropping off some photos at a nearby mailbox. She never returned. Her car was found just yards from the family's driveway. Inside were her shoes, her purse, and the photograph she'd intended to mail. But Shari was gone, vanished in broad daylight. The community panicked. This wasn't a child disappearing from a park late at night. This was a young woman abducted from her own front yard. The police launched a massive search effort, aided by helicopters, volunteers, and bloodhounds. But there were no leads, no witnesses. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the Smith home. It was written in Shari's handwriting, dated the day of her disappearance. It was titled A Last Will and Testament. In calm, composed words, she said goodbye to her family, expressing love and courage. Her parents were devastated, but they held on to hope. Perhaps this was some kind of cruel hoax. Perhaps she was still alive. Then came the phone calls. A man began calling the Smith home, taunting them, claiming to be the one who took Shari. His voice was chilling, calm, deliberate, and disturbingly articulate. He described what Shari had been wearing, details only someone close to her could know. He said she had been comfortable before her death. He told the family where to find her body. Law enforcement traced the call to a payphone, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They found Shari's body exactly where he said it would be, in a remote wooded area, partially clothed. She had been killed execution style. The community, already reeling, plunged into grief and fear. The voice on the phone haunted everyone. Who was this man? Why had he targeted such a bright, innocent girl? 2 weeks later, another girl vanished. 9-year-old Deborah Helmick was taken from her front yard in a trailer park. Again, there were no witnesses, no sign of a struggle. Once again, the killer called the Smith home, identifying himself and telling them where to find Deborah's body. Her remains were located, also dumped in a rural spot. The murders, separated by only weeks, had chilling similarities. Police knew they were hunting the same manic killer who craved power and attention, who enjoyed instilling fear. Despite dozens of tips and composite sketches, no arrests were made. The FBI joined the hunt. Behavioral profilers were brought in, creating a psychological portrait of a highly intelligent, narcissistic individual who enjoyed manipulation. Phone calls were recorded, studied, and replayed on national news. The case gained media attention across the country, but still, the killer remained a ghost, haunting phone lines and rural roads. The question wasn't just who he was, but when he would strike again. The break in the case would come not from fingerprints or surveillance footage, but from an unusual clue: a cassette tape recording. The FBI had managed to capture and preserved several of the chilling calls made to the Smith family, and audio analysis became a key focus. Behavioral profilers studied the cadence of the caller's voice, the word choices, the eerie calm he maintained. As he described murder, this was not a frenzied killer. This was a man who had thought about his crimes, practiced his delivery, and enjoyed the attention it brought. With the FBI's behavioral analysis unit involved, the case took on a more refined strategy. Agents believed the killer would strike again, but he didn't. Instead, the voice fell silent. For nearly a month, investigators stood still until a forensic artist working with the FBI received a tip about a man named Larry Gene Bell. He was a local electrician with a history of erratic behavior, and crucially, he had been out on bond. At the time of both murders, Bell was arrested for an unrelated incident, a kidnapping in North Carolina. But once in custody, his demeanor raised suspicions. He talked in cryptic phrases, referencing guilt and salvation, and when asked direct questions, would deflect into vague, philosophical monologues. It was unsettling. Investigators obtained a sample of his voice. When played side by side with the recordings from the Smith case, there was a disturbing match. Family members who had received the calls instantly recognized the timbre and cadence. It was him, the man who had tormented them through the telephone. Forensic experts confirmed the match through spectrographic voice analysis, a relatively new technique at the time. But that wasn't all. A search of Bell's residence uncovered a trove of damning evidence. Among the items found were drafts of the letter written by Sherry Smith suggesting Bell had coached or forced her to write the last will and testament. There were also fibers and hair samples linking Bell to the scene. Piece by piece, the case assembled itself. Larry Gene Bell was charged with both murders. His trial was a media spectacle. The prosecution leaned heavily on the audio evidence and the psychological manipulation Bell had inflicted on the victims' families. The defense, meanwhile, tried to argue mental illness, portraying Bell as deeply disturbed rather than maliciously calculating. The jury didn't buy it. In 1990, Larry Gene Bell was sentenced to death for the murders of Shari Smith and Deborah Helmick. He spent nearly a decade on death row, during which time he continued to exhibit strange behavior, writing bizarre letters, speaking in riddles, and refusing to give closure to the families. He never expressed true remorse, nor did he offer any plausible explanation for why he had committed such heinous acts. He was executed by electric chair in 1996, taking with him the full scope of his motives. While justice had been served, the emotional scars lingered. The Smith and Helmick families, though resolute in their faith and strength, were forever changed. The case also had lasting effects on investigative procedure. It demonstrated the power of forensic audio analysis and the importance of psychological profiling in catching elusive criminals. For the public, the story remained a haunting example of evil's ability to masquerade as normalcy. Bell had no extensive criminal record, no outward signs of psychopathy. He was the man next door, the repairman, the passerby, the voice on the line. And for weeks in 1985, he held a town in his grip. The memory of Shari Smith and Deborah Helmick lives on in the form of advocacy and safety campaigns aimed at preventing future tragedies. Their names are etched into the collective memory of a community that once believed something like this could never happen there until it did. On a June morning in 1991, in the quiet town of South Lake Tahoe, California, 11-year-old J.C. Dugard walked to her school bus stop. It was a familiar routine. On a familiar road, lined with pine trees and homes set back from the street. But this day would change her life and the lives of her family forever. As J.C. waited near the bus stop, a gray car pulled up beside her. Before she could react, a man reached out, stunned her with a taser, and dragged her into the vehicle. It was over in seconds. She was gone. The community mobilized within hours. Flyers with J.C.'s image went up all over town. Search parties fanned out through the forests and neighborhoods. Her mother, Terry Probin, appeared on television, pleading for her daughter's return. Law enforcement treated the case with urgency. But despite their efforts, the trail went cold quickly. No eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, no suspects. In the days and weeks following her disappearance, authorities pursued every lead. Psychics offered visions. Suspected sightings poured in from neighboring counties. But each glimmer of hope collapsed into disappointment. Months turned into years. The media attention faded. For the public, J.C. Dugard became another face on a missing person poster, another child swallowed by the shadows. But what the world didn't know was that J.C. was still alive. She was being held just 170 miles away in a makeshift compound, hidden behind the unassuming home of a man named Philip Garrido. She had been taken not to another state or a foreign country, but to Antioch, California, still within the same northern region. Her captor, a convicted sex offender out on parole, had constructed a network of tents and sheds in his backyard, hidden behind fences and shrubs. It was there that J.C. lived, isolated from the world. For 18 years, Garrido was not alone. His wife, Nancy, had helped orchestrate the kidnapping. Over the years, J.C. was forced into a twisted, controlled existence. She was given a false name, denied access to television, school, or medical care. She bore 2 children fathered by Garrido, starting at age 14. These children grew up within the confines of the compound, believing J.C. to be their older sister. They too had never seen the outside world. Back in South Lake Tahoe, J.C.'s family never gave up hope. Her stepfather, who had witnessed her abduction from a distance but was unable to stop it, remained haunted. Her mother kept her memory alive, holding on to the belief that J.C. was out there somewhere. But as the years rolled by, few still believed the story would ever have a resolution. Meanwhile, Garrido lived a double life. He maintained a seemingly normal facade. He ran a printing business, claimed to be reformed, and even spoke at local universities about his past crimes. He convinced parole officers and neighbors alike that he was just an eccentric man, trying to do better, and in some ways his outward appearance worked to his advantage. No one imagined what was hidden in his backyard, but things began to unravel. In 2009, Garrido, growing bolder and increasingly erratic, brought J.C.'s 2 daughters, then teenagers, with him to the UC Berkeley campus. He wanted to host an event through his so-called religious group. The campus security officers grew suspicious. Something about the girls, how they acted, what they said, didn't sit right. They contacted his parole officer. Soon, Garrido was summoned for questioning. He showed up at a parole office with J.C. and the 2 girls. J.C., under intense psychological manipulation, introduced herself as Alyssa. But as officers continued questioning, the lies began to fall apart. Her story made little sense. Eventually, under pressure, J.C. Dugard revealed her true identity. The revelation sent shockwaves through the country. J.C. Dugard, long presumed dead, was alive. Her mother received a phone call. She had only dreamed of. J.C. was coming home. News cameras swarmed their house. Reporters scrambled to recount the case that had gone cold nearly 2 decades earlier. J.C.'s return home in 2009 was nothing short of miraculous. But what followed was a period of difficult reckoning, not only for J.C. and her family, but for the legal and law enforcement systems that had failed to detect the truth for so long. In the wake of her identification, Philip Garrido and his wife Nancy were arrested and charged with a staggering list of crimes, including kidnapping, rape, and false imprisonment. The courtroom proceedings revealed the full horror of J.C.'s captivity. Investigators uncovered detailed journals she had kept in secret, filled with reflections, fears, and heartbreaking accounts of her daily life in the compound. She had written about giving birth without medical assistance, about the constant presence of her captor, and about the pain of never seeing her mother's face. These writings provided an intimate and devastating glimpse into her world, and they were crucial in building the case against the Garridos. As the investigation expanded, the question on everyone's mind was simple yet damning. How had no one known Garrido had been on parole, with multiple visits from officers over the years? Yet none had looked beyond the main house. The backyard, where J.C. lived with her daughters, had gone uninspected. It was a failure of oversight that prompted widespread outrage and immediate changes to California's parole procedures. Lawmakers demanded accountability, and internal reviews led to sweeping reforms in how parolees, especially sex offenders, were monitored. In court, the Garridos pled guilty in 2011. Philip received a sentence of 431 years to life in prison. Nancy, who had played a direct and active role in the kidnapping, received 36 years to life. There was no trial, no drawn-out legal battle. The evidence was overwhelming. JC's voice, once silenced, now echoed in statements read before the court, reminding the world of the resilience that had carried her through nearly 2 decades of captivity. But perhaps the most remarkable chapter of JC's story was not the arrest or the sentencing, but her recovery. Rather than retreat from the public eye, she chose to step forward. In 2011, she published a memoir titled A Stolen Life, detailing her ordeal with astonishing honesty. It became a bestseller and gave readers an unfiltered look at the psychological scars and the incredible strength it took to survive. JC also established the JAYC Foundation, which helps families reunify after abduction or trauma. Her advocacy work has made her a powerful voice for victims and a symbol of survival. Through interviews and public appearances, she has reminded the world that healing is possible. Even after unthinkable darkness, her daughters, who had known no life beyond the fences of that compound, began building lives of their own in freedom. They enrolled in school for the first time. They saw movies, used computers, and began the long journey toward understanding the truth of their childhood. JC, as both mother and survivor, helped guide them with remarkable grace. The story of JC Dugard resonates not just because of the crime, but because of the strength it took to endure it and to reclaim a life that had been stolen. It's a story that reminds us how easily evil can hide in plain sight, and how important it is for communities and systems to stay vigilant. But more than anything, it's a testament to resilience of a girl lost and then found not just by the world, but by herself. Her case will forever remain etched in the annals of true crime, not simply as a tale of tragedy, but as one of extraordinary survival. And in that, JC Dugard did more than escape the shadows. She became a light for others still trapped within them.